Okay, I think we can begin. Good evening and welcome to the first CTNS Forum of the 2017-18 academic year. I'm Bob Russell, founder and director of the Francisco J. Ayala Center for Theology and the Natural Sciences, and I hold the E.M.G. Barber Chair in Theology and Science here at the GTU. It's a delight to welcome you here. We have a new tradition, 3 years old now, where we highlight current and recent students doing their PhD in Theology and Science at GTU. And so tonight we'll have one current student and then two recent graduates. And because Hun Cho is in Milwaukee, I'm going to present his dissertation. And I'll do it very briefly. We can talk about it. So the public forums are part of the mission of CTNS, which is to promote the creative mutual interaction between theology and the natural sciences. The social sciences, psychological sciences, political sciences have all had their say in the Theological Academy. But it's been really rare to see the natural sciences involved. It's an empty chair at the table, and we try to fill it here. We do it through research, teaching, and public service. Once a year, an annual Russell Family Fellowship. In the spring will be Ron Cole Turner, and first week of March, I hope you can come. Teaching, Ted and I are teaching a doctoral seminar right now in theology and science. Some of our students are here. And of course, public service, getting the news out to the wider audience. That's through our website, through this sort of format, and various programs. So let's get right into it. I'll introduce each of the student presenters as in turn. So we'll start with Austin, and Austin has graciously agreed to present his thoughts. He's working on this dissertation, and his topic, as you can see, is the eternity of God and the temporality of creation, which, as Ted said, is a small topic, but it'll do for tonight. Austin was a student at St. Olaf in Northfield, Minnesota, and the reason why I know it's in Northfield because I taught at college. So, in fact, I went to one St. Olaf football game, and they won. It was the first game they won. At 49 games they lost, and they were angry that I came because I caused them to win. So I have a long history. He was a major in biology and computer science, which is great, double major, and he has a career now in clinical research. He did his MDiv at Southeastern Baptist Theological Seminary, and now he's here. And it's a delight to have him speak on this topic because if any of you know my own research, it's very much focused on this kind of issue. So I'm looking forward to learning a lot from Austin. Austin, thank you for coming.
Hi, I mentioned to Ted earlier when he brought that up that this is a small topic, that to me this is kind of the centerpiece of theology proper and therefore of theology at large. And so I tackle it, I'm trying to tackle it, and I am still in process. I'm not actually working on my dissertation yet, but I will be, and this is the topic that I'm planning on doing for my dissertation, although the title is likely to change. Because if we can tackle a topic like this, then our theology deriving from it becomes a lot easier. Once you have that centerpiece or a few centerpieces put together, then it's a matter of working out the implications rather than having to do significant work at each stage in the process. So I tackle the hard things first to try to make the other things easier. That being said, you can see the little subtitle that I put here, Where and How Can We Talk About the Two in Relation or Opposition? Of course, the tradition in theology has been to talk about things as an analogous as opposed to univocal or multivocal, to say that we can learn something from our reality and apply it to the divine in some way or another. In this particular topic, of course, there's been two major historical things, and I apologize for the smallness of the type, but I didn't realize that it was going to be so small when I put it together. There's been two major traditional things. Both of these are rooted in ancient Greek philosophy. So we have the timelessness, which more or less can be derived to Plato's idea of eternity as the standard for the forms, and temporality as the shadow, the casting the shadow down of the forms, the working through all of that. It can be more or less derived from that. More important to theology is that it was imported into Catholic theology at large, and theology at large, obviously, at the time, through the work that St. Thomas Aquinas did, that adopted more or less a Platonic view. Now, there are people who will argue with me on that, and they'll say that he didn't actually adopt Platonism. But it's more or less a Platonic incorporation in Christian theology through Irenaeus and through the whole series of the patriarchs that reached its pinnacle in Aquinas. But it's the idea that although time changes, divine immutability is a necessary prerequisite to call God perfect. That if anything can change, then it loses something in the changing. And if it loses something in the changing, then it could have had that prior to the change. Therefore, it was incomplete or imperfect. And so the analogy that Aquinas uses is more or less the analogy of the dissimilarity between our experience and divine experience. That while we see time progressing, and that progress, even though there's change, does not necessarily result in a loss to us. It can be a loss or a gain or neither. God can't lose. And if God can't lose, then God can't change. So that's the dissimilarity of the analogy. The everlastingness is the other traditional view. These are the two who have stood throughout Christian time for whatever purpose, for whatever cause. But it's the unending progression of time, similar to the way that we understand it. So rather than God being of a different status and unable to change, God endures for infinity. So it's the everlastingness of time, or the endlessness of time. Focusing on the dissimilarity in the finiteness versus the infiniteness of the span of time, but mostly on the similarity in that divine experiences, or the divine life is similar to ours in that it encompasses progression in some way. Now, even within this, notably, they still hold to divine immutability, that God himself doesn't change, but eternity is like time in that it progresses, and there is a progression to it. It's just that eternity is endless, infinite in that progression, where temporality is finite in that progression. Certainly at the beginning, although there's some question as to whether it would be finite in the future. But so there's the similarity in the analogy for eternity versus temporality in the progression there. It's early on. It's seen in Origin. There's some other major figures early on that highlight this as well. But the debate really was these two processes early, these two concepts early. In the modern era, certainly since 1900, but even before that, there's been a lot of efforts to try to present alternative options. Options that don't require that we have a static eternality, nor require an unending progression of time. They're trying to resolve the dissimilarity, trying to understand the analogy differently, so that we aren't dependent on a static or an endless progression, a static reality or an endless progression. So one of these examples, process theology, is an example that's trying to look at eternity as essentially non-existent. That eternity is the collection of the things that have happened so far, which makes it not anything different, merely a collection of what exists. Like a warehouse where you throw all of your unused computer disks or used computer disks or whatever. Computer disks are little things that you put in computers, they used to. They're like memory sticks now. Anyway. So that's what process theology has sought to do. There's been a lot of options as well in the German theological and philosophical world to try to present it. But the biggest focus of those German authors has been to look at eternity as the source of temporality rather than as distinct from temporality. Pannenberg, Tillich, even Heidegger at least gets into a little bit of that sort of discussion in his later works. But the idea is that there's something that goes back, and this goes back to Augustine. Augustine really does try to drive temporality as deriving from eternality, and not just, although it's important that he does so, not just because time was created with creation, but because eternity is the grounding in which time exists, where Augustine goes with it. So these all go back to Augustine's work on time. So this is an old argument, but Augustine more or less worked it out to a presentist solution, which is this last thing. But all of them are trying to work out, even in light of Kant's a priori intuitions. The two a priori intuitions are time and space. And the idea is that nothing that humans can do or experience exists outside of space and time. Everything is seen through those lenses, which to Kant essentially meant that we were incapable of going beyond time to understand what eternity was. But that all of these options are trying to find a way to escape those a priori intuitions and say something real about what eternity might look like. And presentism, I mentioned, is where Augustine ended up with. Presentism is the idea that the past no longer exist, the present doesn't yet exist. The only thing that actually exists is the present. The extent to which that present is taken up into eternity, or is available to eternity, is debated. Although generally speaking, everybody agrees that God has access to all presents, but he has access to them as present rather than as past or as future in the presentist perspective. So these are all ways to try to escape this conundrum of all of our experiences are time-based. Kant's a priori intuition. All of our experiences are time-based, and yet we're saying that God is eternal, and we're trying to find a way to make meaning of that. All of these options, both the timelessness, the everlastingness, and these more modern options, are all trying to accomplish the same thing, to say something meaningful about God's eternity, despite our being bound by temporal experience. So that's from the Christian theological perspective. From the scientific perspective, this also tends to be rooted in the Greek philosophy in the ancients. But instead of drawing back to Plato, and by the way, the alternative, Heraclitus, was more or less opposed to Plato on those alternatives. But it tends to drive back to Aristotle. Now, Aristotle wrote, some of the earliest works that we currently recognize as scientific, although that's also debatable. But he identified that time was the measure of change. And in fact, for Aristotle, movement, motion, all of these things represented change. And the only way that we know that there's time is because there's change. And there's some debate as to whether in Aristotle's works, if there was a period of changelessness, would time be experienced? And it's unclear in his work whether that's the case. But this concept of what time was in the scientific world was really kind of the fundamental insight until at least the 1800s. At least probably through the end of the 1800s. Probably through the 1800s. When you add to that the idea that comes from Augustine again, that duration is necessary for experience, and Augustine has a whole series of works on this where he talks about a sentence, where you both remember the beginning of the sentence and you anticipate what the end of the sentence is to make meaning of the sentence. That happens over a span of time. And so even though we only have access to the present moment, through anticipation and through memory, we have access to a duration of time. Well, those were the fundamental bases upon which our understanding of time, both philosophical, theological, and scientific in particular, were grounded until the 1800s, and particularly until we get to Einstein. Now, there's a lot of work that goes on in the 1800s that makes Einstein's theories possible. And I don't want to overlook that, but in our framework today, Einstein is the person that we point to, because Einstein's special theory of relativity and later his general theory of relativity gave us insight into the idea that time might not be uniform or universal, that there might not be a universal time that we can talk about. Before that, there was consideration about this as a possibility, but with his theory, he showed that it might not be the case. Ultimately, however, it should be noted that Einstein's theory of relativity doesn't actually talk about time itself. Einstein's theory of relativity talks about measuring time, and particularly measuring simultaneity. Do two events happen at the same point when they aren't at the same place? And can we ever know that? That's what Einstein's talking about. He's not actually talking about the reality of time or the theory from a scientific, philosophical, or theological perspective as to what time is. And yet, he opened the door to have a different imagination about what time could be. Because it no longer was a uniform, static movement from second to second to second to second. Things change. Well, of course, because of Einstein, and I'll skip down to the quantum mechanics for the second, but because of Einstein, then we have the idea of a four-dimensional reality, that space and time are uniform in the experience of everything. And not only that, but then the later idea, and I'll get to this in just a second, but the later idea that motion is four-dimensional motion. The faster you move through space, the slower you move through time, and vice versa. And all of it already exists. We merely move. And that's the four-dimensional block universe that Minkowski, in his geometry of space-time, presented. And then we have the quantum mechanics piece, that more fundamentally than anything else overturned our ideas of what reality was. We now know that all of classical physics is categorically wrong. It works, but it's wrong. And because it's wrong, what all of that looks like changes. Now, in particular, I've highlighted here the wave theory, the wave function, and the particular application of entanglement, that distant particles are somehow related. And with the collapse of the wave function, a particle in one location affects a particle that's distant. Well, if that's what really happens, then that's what really happens. But it also leads to the possibility that everything is a wave. And so it's not distant causation. It's merely that the two things are already related. And it's impacting the whole thing together. Well, that matters to Pannenberg. So Pannenberg is the theologian that I've kind of been focusing on most recently. And he depends upon this field theory in scientific causation for his ontology it's a futurist ontology, that the future causes the present. And the future causes the present because the waves of possibility that are present collapse into the reality of the moment when the present occurs. So the possibility becomes narrower and narrower until it collapses into the reality that we experience in any given moment. Well, if we follow that wave theory where the whole of a moment, the whole of a quantum equation or quantum field is one object, then he seems to suggest that there's actually a much broader point than this. He goes a variety of different ways, and I'm not trying to belabor the point, but that if it's broader than this, then it's not just the minutiae, the quantum that can be impacted, but those little things can impact bigger things. And possibly there's even waves that are bigger than we could imagine from a quantum perspective that affect larger realities. The possibilities of whether we might go to war again. That's a possibility field in some way that we might not have understood scientifically, but analogously to our quantum field might collapse and we have a war or we don't. And ultimately, his future ontology depends upon an eschatological reality that manifests in the present. So it's not just the near future that causes the present, but God or the eschaton, and depending on where you read in Pannenberg, it looks both ways, impacts the present moment by manifesting something from the eternal eschatological future into the present reality. So the future in that way, the distant future, the eschaton, impacts the present, not just the near future. Well, so we have these options. We can go back to the timelessness or the everlastingness of the older concepts, or we can look at the eternity as the source of temporality and really investigate what this means. Because if eternity is the source of temporality, then how is it the source of temporality? How is it dissimilar? And how do all of those things work together? We have the possibility, and I mentioned it with looking at Pannenberg, that if we take field theory and we expand it beyond the bounds of what is scientifically reasonable at this point, that we might have some sort of universal field theory, that we can still talk about the collapse of possibilities, or the collapse of unified subjects that are at distance but are actually the same thing, into manifesting a reality that would otherwise not be possible. So Ted asked me earlier, is there a way that God can work in the world? Well, this is one of the ways that God could theoretically work in the world. If God is a part of a field that all of creation is a part of, then God could collapse little pieces of it at will, and it would be unobservable to those bound within creation. And yet, it would be a model of divine action. We also have, I told you there were 4 of them. We have the concept, and this is a concept that is out there, nobody has done serious work on it yet, but of the emergence of temporality itself as an emergent phenomenon. Now, there are indicators that this is feasible thing, and Pannenberg digs into this a little bit when he talks about God having the idea to create, or the end goal, the telos, to create free acting agents. And free acting agents must be temporal. Now, that criteria is a little bit sketchy, but if free acting agents must be temporal, then creation could have been created timelessly to manifest an emergence of time to accomplish the telos of free acting agents. So it's a possibility that we have an emergent temporality. It might also just be a random temporal occurrence, that beings exist that experience things in a progression. That would be going back to more of that block universe and saying that we are four-dimensional beings that merely move. And we perceive that movement as movement in time, when it's merely movement in reality. Or, and this is the model that I'm trying to get to, and I'm not there yet. And I could talk for a lot longer about just this model. But I'm calling it eternal presentism now. I used to call it eternal causation, but that only encompasses the causation aspect of it. It doesn't encompass the actual reality of eternality and temporality. But it fundamentally is similar to the idea of presentism. But instead of the present being a moment that is temporary, that passes, and we progress through in sequence, we have instead an eternity that it changes. But eternity only exists as it currently exists. Currently, of course, being a temporal term that is inappropriately applied to eternality, but that the eternity only is what it is. It may at one point have been something else, or it may yet at one point be something else. But at any given moment, and again, that's a temporal word that's misapplied, but at any given point in progression, it can only exist with what exists, because the effect destroys the cause. The present, again, to use the present analogy, the present replaces the past and is in turn replaced by the future. Well, if eternal reality is such that what once was no longer is, and again, temporal, I apologize, everything we use is temporal. It's very difficult to speak timelessly. But if what was is not what is, and what was no longer exists at all, how can we say that it was? Now, the problem with that has been that people have accused that of being a circular reason, and in some cases a vicious circle. That if we rely upon eternity as being something like time, then whatever holds eternity must itself be different from eternity, and that itself has to have progression, and if time is merely the progression of things, then eternity, in the way that I'm talking about it, is merely progression. But if time is not merely the progression of things, if time exists as something other than mere succession, then we can talk about it not as a circular thing, because time is not merely succession and eternity is not merely succession. But eternity is qualitatively different. It's fundamentally different than time. It is the source for the progression that we perceive in time, but it is not itself progression. It is mere static what is. That's about all I have to say.
Great. Is that the student's question?
What?
Take tutor questions?
Oh yeah, I'll take questions. I'm fine with that. Yes, Ted.
A few years ago, Bob and I offered a course on time and eternity. And among other things, we reread carefully St. Augustine and Boethius. And the more I looked at their arguments, the more it seemed to me that eternity is God. That eternity isn't an attribute. It's not a temporal category. It's just the being of God. Certain characteristics. What do you think about that?
I certainly think that's one way to look at it. I tend to have a problem with that because I think that we are eternal beings. Humans. And if we look at the biblical revelation as such, it certainly indicates that there is an eternal aspect to all of humanity. And not just to humans, but to angels and demons, if you take those beings seriously. That there are eternal beings that are not God. And if there are eternal beings that are not God, then eternity cannot be God without becoming pantheistic or panentheistic at least. And I struggle with those as options, but because I take that seriously, that we are eternal beings, I tend to reject the argument that, and I agree with you, that Boethius and others seem to be leaning toward, if not actually outright saying, that eternity is God and vice versa. So yeah, yes?
Thank you for dealing with very important and very difficult issue. Because I didn't know your study about time and eternity, and my topic is almost the same. So I'm preparing my proposal to my dissertation, and I'm just focusing on the models of time.
The models of time, yeah.
Time's model is there are linear times and circular times. And
yeah.
How 20th centuries and contemporary theologians try to overcome the traditional models of time. That is my topic.
Sure.
So it's not question, but just comment. But I think Ted already talked about Boethius' definition of eternity, and I think how can we just read Boethius' definition of time is very important, because he said eternity is interminable life. So interminable life can be understood as timelessness. And many philosophers and theologians understood Boethius' ideas of time as timelessness. But recently, many people just try to interpret that in just everlastingness.
Yeah.
But I think without talking about the aspect of life, it's impossible to talk about the definition of eternity. That's my thinking. And my question is that in your title of presentation, you try to separate between God's eternity and temporality of the world. So you maybe think eternity is very similar to timelessness than everlastingness. What do you think? Where is your position?
Well, so two things. I actually think that the Latin in Boethius suggests a different interpretation than limitless, more limitless life rather than unending life or whatever. But I do think the aspect of life is fundamental for how we understand time to devolve from eternity, how time comes from eternity. Part of it is the imbuing of life into beings that makes time. And again, whether you're talking about life as life itself, or whether you're talking about life as mere motion, or whether you're talking about life in other aspects, ultimately, I don't fall down on the side of either timelessness or everlastingness. I want to present a model that looks at eternity as fundamentally different than what it has been traditionally looked at. And the models of time that you're talking about, whether you're talking about linear or circular or other shapes that we analogize time to be, those models are relatively unimportant in the debate about what eternity is, if I'm right, that it's something else. Because our progress through time is merely our progress through time. It doesn't necessarily devolve onto our meaning of what eternity is. So.
Let's give Austin a round of thanks.
Thank you.